Hi, everybody. My name is Elle, and I'm the host of this podcast where I speak with the stewards of conservation about their work in science, the specimens that they work with, and how their roles can teach us to engage more with the natural world so we can find more action to protect it. As somebody who calls himself a peripheral scientist, working in disciplines that straddle both art and science, I find science can sometimes be quite intimidating. So my hope is these conversations will help make science accessible and show roles of representation to people who might not have imagined job titles for them before. Today's guest is somebody who is a dear, dear friend. She is an absolute trailblazer in our industry, and it gives me great pleasure to be talking to another taxidermist. So, here to tell you her story on how she became a taxidermist, the highly revered, accredited scholar that is Jazmine Miles-Long. Jazmine, I'm so thrilled to have you here on my podcast. It's such a pleasure. How are you doing?
I'm okay, yeah. I'm excited to see you. I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm feeling good.
There is absolutely no reason to be nervous. This is just two taxidermists hanging out, here for a good time. And your work is so interesting, and there's so much that I know you're going to educate, not only me, but my listeners. So let's get straight in. The first question I tend to ask my guests is actually to go right back to the start. So I want to know what the world looked like for you when you were younger, when you first started taking stock of the natural world and it became important to you.
Yeah, so I think, first off, I never thought I would be a taxidermist. It wasn't even something I knew about. And as a little kid and a neurodiverse little kid, I definitely struggled with the academic side of school. And it was very obvious that art was my strong point, and I would get certificates for that, and my parents would, they really supported that part of it. But I also really loved science, and I tried my hardest to continue with, A levels, GCSEs, all those things in science. But yeah, the academic side of things, I just found it so difficult. And animals as well were definitely more interesting to me than people, although, I like people now more than I did when I was a kid. But yeah, I definitely found a lot more comfort and interest in animals. And as by the age of 9, I was like a very, I wouldn't say aggressive vegetarian, but maybe like outspoken vegetarian. And my parents weren't pushing that on me or anything like that. It was definitely coming from my love of animals and my understanding of what they were, and that they die to be eaten. So it kind of, in some ways, it makes sense. But I don't know if you did that thing at school where they print out your career.
Yes.
I don't know. I'm a little bit older than you. Okay, yeah. They printed it out, and it was something like, well, the first one was a butcher, basically. And obviously, as a kid, I was absolutely
Oh my
horrified. But
goodness.
I know, but it kind of makes sense
Sure.
because it's like artistry or a craft with animals.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I was just really obsessed with art. And at a very young age, I wanted to do an art degree. And I didn't finish my A levels. I went to university early, and my parents took me to all the art universities when I was still in. I think I was still in primary school or like early secondary school. I mean, like really like ridiculous age, because I think they wanted to. At school I was being told art's not a decent career.
Right.
Why would you do that? Maybe business would be better, and I'm just so terrible at that side of life.
But they
So.
don't teach us that. There's no rule book for business, especially when you go down an artistic track.
No.
You're kind of completely left to your own devices. I don't know if you found this, but the creative subjects is kind of like, okay, well, you brought this on yourself. You chose this. You're on your own.
Absolutely. And even with I did end up going to art university, and I did sculpture at Brighton. And even there, they don't teach you how to apply for Arts Council funding or anything that actually supports you as a practitioner. And that's also, I've only recently, in the last maybe 5 years, started learning about that. And I graduated over 16 years ago. So it's just crazy.
Well, you've done quite a lot of finding grants and getting sponsorship, and we will talk about that kind of later, because I think that's really useful, especially for people listening that might not necessarily want to be a taxidermist, although I'm sure they will after hearing our conversation, but maybe who are artists themselves and creatives and are finding that they're in that place of limbo where they're not really getting that support.
Totally, yeah.
Well, definitely.
Like even just like learning how to do a tax return would have been useful, wouldn't it? But anyway,
Absolutely. That's not
another
necessarily
thing.
something we can help on this particular conversation,
No.
though. But Jazmine, you talked a little bit about your vegetarianism, and that kind of brings me really nicely to my next question, which is a little bit about the expression ethical taxidermy, which is a phrase that you coined quite early in your own career. Now, this has actually become a bit of a buzzword in the industry, and lots of people use it now. But due to the subjectivity of ethics, how do you therefore define your ethical position, and give me a definition of what ethical taxidermy means to you?
Okay, so I'll start it with, so when I started in 2007 doing taxidermy as my kind of business, I just couldn't find anything which aligned with my values. Only using things from natural causes at the time was kind of my main thing. And so that's why I decided my online presence, I would use that word, which now, as you say, is a buzzword. Lots of people, ethical to, it means different
Sure.
things to lots of people, artists, taxidermists. And I think that it's important when you're approaching someone that calls himself an ethical taxidermist to ask what that actually means. As you say, it could mean they do still use some animals from certain avenues, which is still considered ethical, but not necessarily the same as another taxidermist.
Mhm.
But for me, it's like a holistic approach to my practice. So it's the way I source my animals using only animals that have died from natural causes. That does include for me euthanasia if an animal is in a zoo and is, terminally ill or has had a bad accident.
Mhm.
But it's mostly things that have flown into windows, hit by cars, and stuff like that, old age and illness. But as well as where I get my animals from, it's about the materials I put inside the taxidermy. So for me, I'm looking at, is the material sustainable? Where it's sourced from? Is it paying into things which are bad for the environment? Is it paying into poor wages and poor living conditions for people? Just because I want to make sure that when I leave, I feel like the footprint I've left with my practice. Because as an artist, sometimes you can feel quite selfish. It's a funny one.
Mm.
I want to make beautiful things for the world, but then it's a bit like, why aren't I a doctor, or why aren't I doing something to actually help people? So at the least, I don't want to cause any problems, and I want the materials to be stable, which means that they last a long time and don't cause problems in conservation within museums where most of my work goes in the future. And also, it also includes the way that I make work. So I don't take on many commissions that I'm asked for because I don't consider them to be maybe respectful on my values
Sure.
of how I want to represent an animal. So for me, ethics is kind of everything. And just all sorts of things. At home, the shampoo you use might not be tested on animals, but are the paints you use tested on animals? And just things that you might not even think about as an artist.
It's fascinating because you have embarked on so many projects, which I'm going to give you the opportunity to talk about in a second, that have taught our industry, which is still quite a small industry, so much and has got us asking questions. So it brings me to a question that I actually had for later in our conversation, but I feel like now is the perfect time to ask it. And that is, I think you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but obviously sustainability is at the heart of everything that you do and informs so many of the decisions you make specifically about the materiality. Tell me about the project that you recently completed or have ongoing called A Stable Future.
Yeah, so I got funding through the Arts Council, DYCP funding, which I recommend anyone who is an artist or taxidermist, creative person to look at if they're in the UK, because it's basically developing your creative practice. It's looking at something in your practice that you want to research or grow in, but it doesn't have to have an outcome. It's just about growth. And so I applied for looking at the materials within my practice and finding different ways of working. And I got that in 2021. And when I started, I was looking at using wax instead of resins and things like that. But I spoke to Conservator, who's the head of conservation at I'm just gonna say Natural History Museum Denmark, but I'm probably gonna get the institution name wrong, and I'm really
That's okay.
sorry.
I can put it in the footnotes. It's fine.
Okay, and it's Bethany Palumbo. I was talking to Bethany, I think, about insurance actually, because I had another job where I needed to insure a polar bear, and I didn't know how to do that. And I'd asked Bethany if she had any recommendations. And I think at the same time, I kind of mentioned if she knew about certain materials, whether they're conservation grade. And through that conversation, I found out many of the things that we use, which are specifically targeted to taxidermists, certain brands, they haven't been tested. And if they have, it's kind of not something that's publicly available.
Mm-hmm.
And so Bethany said, hey, why don't we Oddy test them? And so I was like, wow, yes. And so the project went in a direction I hadn't quite anticipated, but it was brilliant. And Bethany helped me get them tested at Cardiff University. And yes, to see if some of the materials that I've always been a bit suspicious of, like the polyurethane foam, for instance, which is really, really widely used, very popular in America and all over the world, just is it suitable for taxidermy? And I've always not wanted to use it, and I haven't used it for many years, just because I can't justify to myself that it is the right thing, but I haven't been able to kind of prove to myself why, apart from the fact that it's plastic kind of based. So Bethany got all these things tested with Cardiff University's help, and yes, it shows that many of the materials I was suspicious of are not suitable, but we weren't very happy with the quality of the test. So now what Bethany has done is, through her museum, has actually purchased all the equipment, which is insane.
Wow.
And she has recently tested it, and we've got all the results, but we're going to have a meeting in the new year and write a paper and get it published. And once it's published, I'll make sure that I get it out there to everyone in the taxidermy community to read. And we did present the results at Spinach 2022, the results we had so far. And yeah, it's just a really exciting thing. It's like, I don't know if you know much about museum practice. They have, best practice rules, which are kind of the best ways to do certain things in museums, would be kind of the best way to describe it.
Sure.
But there really isn't one for best practice in taxidermy. And it's, people that don't know about museums or taxidermy might not realize that museums are acquiring taxidermy all the time still for their collections, their science collections, and also their exhibitions and educational stuff. And so I really want people to just be aware of what's happening so that they can ask the questions. If it's a piece for education and handling, it's about, is that piece safe for children to touch? Has it been used any chemicals that might harm people, or has it been killed, so that when a child says, have you killed this, they can say, no, this is how it died. And then the other side is, if it's a piece that's being created for science or museums, is that piece going to harm anything else in the environment where it is? And so that's kind of what all that's about. And I just find it's just so geeky and so exciting, because a lot of people don't even care about taxidermy. And then here we are, like, really caring about it, because even though some people might not think taxidermy is still relevant today, the collections that we have from a time we would have considered not great, when we were killing animals before we had certain laws like the Wildlife and Countryside Act and things that keep our wildlife safe. The animals that were collected during that time still are incredibly important within these collections, and there are examples of things which are extinct or very rare. And not only are they kind of an aesthetic example of the animal, which is what I think people think when they think of taxidermy, it's also an actual sample of the animal's DNA. So scientists are using these collections all the time. So when we're putting new things into them, we want to make sure that our things will still be here in 100 years and more, like the ones that were made using natural materials 100 years or more ago. That's kind of what all of that's about. And I just love it.
I'm I just love listening to you talk about it because you just kind of ooze charisma. And I love to hear how excited you are because this is my industry. And to have you kind of spearheading it is great for me. So in a purely selfish way, I know this benefits me as well. So it's lovely to hear how impassioned you are. And it's so exciting for all of us as an industry as a whole. I kind of want to dive into something that you talked about briefly in that answer. And that was that taxidermy is kind of like a forgotten craft. It's not given the same sense of respect as other creative practices. And historically, many taxidermists, particularly women, have been undocumented. I read in an article with Elle magazine that you did that you feel taxidermy is not treated with that same respect. So, talk to me about this feeling. How does it affect you? And do you feel like it's progressing or has had any change?
So, and I get really kind of, at the moment, I don't know what it is, something in the air, but I get really emotional about it at the moment. And I'm going to try really hard not to get emotional. And I think it's because, so taxidermy for me is not what I think of,
Sure.
that I think is in the brains of other people when they think of taxidermy. Um, and rightfully so. I think it's kind of instantly thought that it's connected to blood sports and it's part of colonialism and all of these things, which is very true. But I think that it, through the industry's growth and change with people like yourself and other taxidermists, which are kind of from our generation, which I would say are predominantly women. There are guys out there too, but it seems to be growing more at the moment with female artists. But so I wouldn't say that taxidermy is considered a craft at all. I would say it's considered this thing that people do with dead animals that's gross. I genuinely think that's what it is. And I think that when people go to a museum, they see the taxidermy and they love the museum, but they see it as this weird thing. They do not think about how the object's been made as an object. And I know it's horrible to say an animal is an object, but in the context of taxidermy, the taxidermist, in the kind of, even though I'm very sensitive in my approach to taxidermy, I still, I'm still going to describe it like this because taxidermy is made from a skin, which essentially is like fabric. And then the artist has made a sculpture and they've upholstered the fabric onto the sculpture. And there is no way that that animal would look like that, or that what people see as an animal, that sculpture would look like that without the taxidermist. And the layers of craft that people don't see, the carving, the sculpting, the casting, the blisters on your hands, the years of experience. And the whole point of it is that when you look at it, you just see the essence of the animal. And what we want, me and you, is that they do not see anything that we've done, not at all. And it's so difficult to know how to strip that back so that people understand what's going on inside. And I have created sculptures which show maybe the inner workings of birds and things. And there's one at Derby Museum in their Notice Nature Gallery. But a lot of the time, and it shows the balsa wood sculpture inside, but a lot of the time people see that and you hear visitors say, what happened to that bird? Was it ill? Rather than think, oh, that's a craft. And so my way of trying to deal with this, and I think the reason I'm getting emotional at the moment about it, is because I'm trying to show how this is a craft. I'm trying to show all of the levels through getting into the craft industry. So I see that art and craft and museums, they're three really different areas. And museum people, they get it. They can see it's a craft. They understand because they have conservation and they understand these things are very fragile. The art world is different because it's the art world, but the craft world is about how things are made, and it's perfect for taxidermy. But we are just not represented. There's literally nobody. So I've recently got a scholarship with Quest, which is the Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Trust, which I also recommend to any makers that are at kind of a higher level in their career and they're looking for extra training. But also that Quest has never supported a taxidermist before. And not only did I want funding for the training, I wanted quest to be supporting this craft. And I'm also approaching many other institutions which represent craft in general within the UK. I'm only UK at the moment, because I want it to have the same value of, wow, that's craft, as a silversmith or someone that creates a vase out of clay or wood or anything. It's the same level of skill, but it is not respected. It's just so not respected. And the wording, I've been emailing different, I won't name anybody now, maybe in the future, but I've been emailing different institutions which have, they're like craft institutions, and they might have a page of what is taxidermy. And honestly, I read them. Some of them have made me cry. I'm just like, that's what you think I am. It's just not true. It's just so sad because, like, who cares, right? But me and you, we really care. I really care about this stupid job that I have, but it's not because I care about the job. It's because I care about the animals, and I care about the process, this beautiful process, which is a relationship between the animals, and how we can use this art to help actual conservation in the field and other things, because it's just so damn beautiful when it's done well.
Yeah. No, I think you surmised that perfectly and so succinctly, because it is incredibly frustrating. And I'd like to kind of almost play devil's advocate, because I have you here. I think I know what you're going to say, but how do you therefore, I mean, we've talked a little bit about craft there specifically, but how do you then respond to the argument that taxidermy isn't art, and how it can exist in an artistic sphere without having to have a conceptual narrative?
Yeah, so I'm trying. I struggle with that too, because for me, I see it as art. It's beautiful, but I think it's because of the whole thing that I said before about how we're constantly trying to hide any maker's ownership on the animal.
Right.
We just want it to look exactly as the thing, and I think that with art, that's a problem. But I don't think with craft it's a problem. So that's why I see the worlds as two different things. And I think that for taxidermy to exist in an art context, it does have to have something else because of its history. It's not like ceramics. It doesn't have a respected history, or it hasn't had its day yet. It hasn't had its Grace and Perry moment where he took pots which were not sexy, and he made them sexy, and he made them expensive. And so we need somebody to have a Grace and Perry moment with animals.
We're both working on it. Watch this space.
We'll get there. Yeah.
Okay, so in lieu of that answer and that previous question, how then, Jazz, do you have your own style and your own signature? What do you say that your taxidermy aesthetic is? Or what is it that you're trying to say through your work?
Yeah, so I think every taxidermist definitely has kind of an aesthetic that I like to think when I go to a museum or a gallery, or, lots of artists use taxidermists to make their art as well. So I like to think when I see the actual taxidermy, I can guess who's made it, because we all have a little signature, even though we're all trying to go for the same aim. Like yours is very elegant and sleek and just kind of perfect. That's Elle.
Thank you.
And then mine is definitely annoyingly cute, which I don't like, but I'll definitely move eyes and things and make them cuter, which is not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to follow the photo, but it's fine. But I think with my actual kind of, when I make my artwork, I want people to empathize with I want them to go through a little journey of, wow, isn't that beautiful? I've never been this close to this animal. Wow, it's dead. How sad. How did it die? So with my work, I'm always making sure that I'm pushing where the animal died, how it died. And generally, 99% of the time, it's because of humans.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a little journey of empathy towards the animals. And I haven't yet made the work where I'm like, yes, I will get there. But I want to make work that just stops people in their tracks, basically. Just thinks, what are we doing?
I would argue that your work has the gift of storytelling, because the way that you position not only the specimens and the context, but also with your captions and your general curation, I think, unlike other taxidermists, you do have that storytelling, and it speaks to a much wider conversation than just a rigid model. So don't worry, it is cute.
Thank you.
But
That's so nice. I've never thought of that word storytelling. I'm gonna remember that. You're right. Yeah, I want there to be a story. I don't want it just to be an animal
yeah.
captured in time.
And it's really difficult to achieve that because it is ultimately a rigid model. And so it is just a moment in time. But I think you're able to translate the bit that came before and the bit that came after. So, yeah, whoever's listening that wants to have a look at
Thank
Jazmine's work,
you.
I thoroughly, thoroughly recommend, and I will be absolutely relentlessly plugging your work. I'm going to move from kind of a positive sort of place to something that might be a little bit more difficult to talk about. And if it's uncomfortable, then feel free to, we can move on. But I know from my own experience, and I do try to share this, and I know um, that I do, but there are insurmountable pressures with this job. And those pressures and challenges are things that we don't really talk about. Would you be happy to talk about some of those things and the hardships of this job?
Totally. Yeah.
Let's go.
Number one, it's really hard to do, as you know. It it can ruin your body.
Mm,
It can completely exhaust you. It can stop you having friends
yeah,
because you don't have any time.
sure.
Um, I work late. I don't always get to see my kid sometimes to put him to bed
Mm.
at night because I have to work so late. It can go really wrong, and then you're the only one that can fix it.
Or not
Um,
sometimes.
yeah, or not, and then it's in the bin, and then what do? You got to find another one of this completely rare animal, and
Mm,
often that is not an option.
yeah.
And one example is a koala I've been working on. It had been embalmed with formaldehyde. I've never ever worked on something like that. And I only worked it out because it smelt of rotten apples. And I went to bed and I thought, why couldn't I skin that thing? And I was thinking about the smell, and then I was like, oh no. And then the next day I went in like masked up, full
Good,
body suit,
good.
like really like changed my approach. And I managed to make a sculpture out of it, but it has taken me about 3 times the length for a quote which was not for that animal. So
Mm,
money wise, you just don't know how long things are going to take, how it's going to go wrong, how it's going to go right. That's one side of it. The other side of it is being an artist in general in an industry where there is enough work for us. There is enough work, and I think there'll be more work. But, we are the new generation of taxidermists taking over from an older generation of taxidermists. And I'm going to say now there are some absolutely delightful taxidermists out there who are of the older generation, who are most generally men, that are really supportive. But there is also a real old boys club vibe about some of the older taxidermists that really want to push us down
mm,
as female taxidermists and as the ones essentially taking their jobs. But they're all retiring, and it's going to get better. But I think I've been doing this for just over 16 years, and I do think that for the first 10 years of that, even though I was doing well enough to sustain a business, and I slowly stopped doing other jobs over that time, I was definitely being pushed down
mm,
by other taxidermists, and that's really difficult. So the bullying that happens, and I'm not going to say anything, but about all of this stuff.
sure.
Um, but I think that museums nowadays as well, for me, I'd say most of my work is museum work, and I'd like to change that into making more art stuff. But I think the reason I'm getting more and more museum work, and other taxidermists are getting more and more museum work, is because the people working in museums is changing as
Yeah.
well. That it's mostly women, and generally they want to work with someone that's approachable. And I do a lot of public speaking in museums, so they want someone that's not only approachable and good to work with on a team. They want someone that can go and talk to children about why taxidermy is important, why animals are important. So it's just about being a nice person as well, I
Yeah.
think. And some of the other taxidermists which have been before us, um, aren't necessarily they might be really skilled in taxidermy, but they're not necessarily just basically nice. And
Mm,
I don't want to offend anyone. And all the good ones know exactly who they are, and they're very helpful and wonderful. But it's really it's not an easy job.
no.
but it's really rewarding if it goes well.
If and when.
Yeah, I know, and I kind of like, why do we torture ourselves? I mean, like, why do you like it? Because I think I've been doing it. I started a bit before you, and I don't know. I don't know why I chose it. I think I'm basically crazy.
I ask myself
So I
that
just
question every day, Jazz.
yeah.
It's
I think we're
I
crazy.
think people think, oh my goodness, it's so remarkable and there's such an intimacy. But when you strip it down, all the things that you mentioned, being lonely, torturing ourselves, broken bodies, I mean, it's no joke.
Yeah, it's not it, but the thing is, at the end of it, you have this beautiful thing, and I mean, like, your peacocks, for instance, they are incredible. I've never done a peacock, and
Oh,
I don't want to. I'll
Jazz.
just send them all to you. But I know that the amount of work, like, that's why I don't want to do a peacock, because I just cannot be bothered with that much work. I do
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
big annoying mammals, which are the same amount of work, but it's a different
Oh, yeah.
process, and you're set up for it, and it's just like, but I think when someone sees a picture of an animal like that, they just think, oh, lovely, and they don't think,
Yeah. Yeah.
oh, she's got really chapped hands and she's been chiseling away at this.
Bent over for
Yeah, and,
2
like,
weeks.
cleaning the gross fat off of that.
Mm,
It doesn't look like an animal that would
yeah.
be dirty, does it? It's just, it doesn't, what you get does not show the hard work, basically. And I don't always want to show the hard work, because I don't want people to think, because I'm trying to show how taxidermy is this lovely thing. I don't want to be like, yeah, look how smelly it is sometimes, or, it's just, that's not what I want to give out to the world.
It's a really hard balance to strike, because you want to show enough of the vulnerability of the process and say, look, it's difficult. We are sitting at a defatting machine for 4 hours and my hands are trembling when I come off it because of the vibrations. And, I'm getting repetitive strain disorder in my shoulder because of the way that I have that repetitive motion of skinning. But also, like you say, you don't want to repulse people. And it kind of brings me to this question about working with death. So, obviously, working with death is perceived as a very uncanny thing, specifically in the art world. Do you think about mortality a lot? I know we've kind of skimmed across working with death generally, but does it make you reflect and think about your own mortality or anything about legacy specifically?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. The legacy part of it, I think, with just kind of the basic mortality, working with animals, it's not difficult for me anymore. I think when I started, things like foxes looked a lot like my dog, and
Mm, mm,
it is difficult, I think, when you're working with something that you're not used to, or things like stoats and the smell they give off. It's like, because, I'll be clear, because they have a musk, not because of death, but because they themselves have a musk, which they like to spray on stuff. But yeah, I think that it gets easier as you go along emotionally, and I'm
mhm.
definitely removed, not not by choice, but I'm just, I'll just work on something and I won't realize. And I share my studio with my partner Benjamin, and he's watching, so he can see, and he's like, oh, but for me, I'm just doing my work.
Yeah.
But I say that I recently did a baby baboon. The adult baboon, they're behind me actually in the studio, but the baby baboon was really difficult, because when I removed the skin, it it looks like a human baby,
Mm, mm,
and that was difficult. So I think that, and that does make me think about my son, and it was the same size he would have been at some point.
sure.
So that kind of stuff, it makes me think about sometimes. Legacy wise, I think definitely creating art, you've got to be someone that's interested in leaving a legacy. I think that someone that wants to put their name on stuff, and also just the way that I think that you're working and the way I'm working, trying to lift up our industry, we're trying to leave a legacy within the industry, not just in what we make.
Sure.
So definitely it's like immortalizing yourself, isn't it? Like,
Mm.
the idea of my name being on labels in museums is just like the nicest thing, because when I was younger, and I never saw any representation of people like me, And also I have to say the representation in culturally within taxidermy is really like not broad. You know, like women being part of it's like woo, but actually like having different people from different cultures and things like that. It's just really very slow. But I didn't know who Martha Maxwell was, for instance, who's a female taxidermist from the past. You just don't see, when you Google taxidermy, you'll get all the old famous male taxidermists generally. And I would love it that when younger people are looking at taxidermy, they see your face, they see my face, they see other people that we know who can hopefully inspire them to be within this industry. So yeah, but I think about death a lot anyway. I'm not scared about dying in general, but I'm very scared about my partner, my kids' death. I've always been someone that obsesses over it, and I think that's why as a child I definitely got into this job. I had cats, and at night I would not sleep because I'd be thinking about the day, and I'd be counting how old I would be when they probably would die and things like that. And I think that taxidermy maybe was a way of thinking how I could keep that going. Although I would never be able to do taxidermy on my dog or my cats. I had to bury my cats in the end. Yeah.
I think you have to have a certain sensitivity to be a taxidermist that maybe is not quite as appropriate to be a creative full stop. So if you are a painter, and obviously I am speaking generally here, you might not need the same aptitude for expressing your own creativity. And I think that's because we care and love animals. It's coming through. It's an emotional practice. And I think if you don't love animals, you couldn't do this work. And this is one thing that I often argue on behalf of taxidermy, is very often people assume taxidermists are motivated by brutality. And you think it's ludicrous, because to do this job, you have to have such a connection and a love for the end product, for the animal. You have to want to do it duty. And you wouldn't put yourself through all that horrendous labor if you didn't love animals.
And also I think that if you do have that love, I'm not saying that only people that make good taxidermy love animals. I'm saying that because we all start making bad taxidermy, but because of the love, you really want to do a good job. And so that's what keeps you going and makes you get better and makes you try new techniques and grow until you are making, although I don't think that any of us think our work is actually good, because that's how we've got to this point. And it's because I want to I really want that animal to be loved even though it's dead. It's quite basic.
It's basic, and also it's interesting to establish, I think the first time I'm really thinking about this, that love is really the center of a taxidermist practice. And I would never think love, which is a word that carries so much weight, is a word that I would use in a scientific practice. But I think it is true, and I think it's an interesting
but wait, I just want to add one quick thing, is that I'd say that that's not the case with every taxidermist. So that's the thing. I think, like, for us, that's what we see taxidermy as. But there are still taxidermists that don't make very good taxidermy, because they're not so bothered about the growth of creating something. And it is still taxidermy. So yeah, but for us, it's all about the gooey word love.
Absolutely, that's the perfect description, gooey. And Jazz, you talked a little bit about your son. I wonder, those people who are listening might be curious. How does he connect to your practice, if at all? Have you noticed any changes in the way that he views the world or death or animals to that maybe of other children?
Yeah, so he is 5 now, but he became a vegetarian, and not because, so obviously we don't really eat meat, but I was still feeding him like sausages and things because I wanted his body to understand what all these different foods are, and I wanted him to choose.
Sure.
And I think by the age of 3, he'd figured it out, and he was like, no, and but like so aggressively, so that when he doesn't do it so much now because he goes to school now, so he sees that people eat meat. But before, he would go up to a new friend and say, "Do you eat meat?" And then he would judge them. And he wanted a t-shirt that said, "I'm a vegetarian." He tells everyone he doesn't eat meat, and he cries if he if he finds out that people are, that he really loves. He gets really angry. And so for him, I think, and he's held dead animals since he was a baby, because we would go out, we would find birds, we would pick them up. I'd always let him handle them, obviously washing his hands afterwards for anyone that's weirded out by that. And then just so that he understands, because I think that, and so very, very young, he was asking, Mummy, are you going to die? Do we all die? And he knows all of the answers to these questions already, which is very young, but also it gives him a real sense of empathy for the world. So like, we don't shout at animals, we don't hit them in our cars. And he shouts at cars, slow down. He's like a little anarchist animal rights person already, even though he doesn't even know what that is. So I think that my job is, I think it's good for kids. And I do story time with parents with babies and younger children within museums, talking about death and animals. And I think that really, if you're learning about that as a process, I think it's much more helpful. Potentially, I might be wrong, maybe he'll grow up and be totally messed up, we'll find out. But if something did happen to me or to his dad or anyone who, like a human that he really loves, maybe understanding about this process before that kind of terrible thing might help him a bit better. Normally parents kind of do it through pets. You'd have a pet that might die. And that can be really horrific for the child. I don't know. I just think learning about what life is and that it ends and you have to be respectful. We don't buy new plastic toys because, rather than, I want this thing, and I'm not trying to put the guilt on him, and we definitely don't, but I just want him to understand that our actions impact, and that impact can be death, which is final. We have started talking about how maybe a bit more spiritually to try and calm him down, so that people become stars, but also he needs to know the facts, and I don't ever want to lie to him or a child, because they'll find out one day. And it's the truth, so it's tricky. But yeah, he's very proud. He tells everyone about my job, which isn't always the best. So like, if we're in the supermarket, he might tell someone, we have a dead parrot in our freezer, and they'll be like, okay. Or all of his teachers at school know what I do, and that's fine. But does he follow up with the she only works with things that have died from natural causes, like all the values that I kind of spew out the minute someone finds out what I do. But he's very proud. I don't know. I don't know if he'll become into what, in the same trade, but he's definitely proud and he loves animals. So
that's so lovely. Well, I think that's definitely a testament to what I said earlier about you being a storyteller, not only as a mother, but as an artist and a scientist. Jazz, it's been my greatest pleasure to have you on my podcast. Thank you so much for opening up and talking to me about your practice. And it's just been an absolute
Can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
Okay. I just want to say that through seeing how taxidermy has grown, it's so wonderful now that there are so many different people offering stuff to taxidermists on how to learn and how to grow. And I just wanted to say thank you to you for creating certain platforms like the Facebook group that you started, and your Patreon as well. And I'm not like plugging you, but I'm just saying, when I started in 2007, there was nothing apart from like really old Victorian taxidermy books, or modern ones which were like how to shoot the animal best so that you don't damage the cape, which for me was obviously, what am I doing? I don't want to be in this industry. But now, there's all this stuff, and you create a really good online presence, which I think is very, I'm rubbish at that side of things. And I think that it's really great that, there's places to go for people who are starting. And yeah, I'm excited to see how you not turn out. That's really weird. Where you take your practice into the future as well, because it's really exciting seeing everything.
You're so lovely. You're the most lovely guest. This definitely is not our podcast about me. It's all about you. But thank you, Jazz. I felt emotional, and I'm going to stop myself talking because I'll probably say something stupid. Thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And so there you have it. Jazmine Miles-Long. She's utterly brilliant and just the kindest soul, as you would have noted at the end there. I would love for you to find her, to follow her and to support her work, or even see it in person. Affixed to this episode are the show notes where you can find more about Jazmine and where her work is based. If you would like to find her on social media, you can follow her on Instagram. It's Jazmine_Miles_Long, and her website is JazmineMiles-Long.com. One of the hardships of being a taxidermist is constantly defending ourselves against the misconceptions and stigmas of our practice. If this conversation has in any way reframed or reshaped anything about taxidermy for you, I really encourage you to share it and help amplify the voice and visibility of taxidermy. We really need non-industry folk to help make our industry more accessible. Thank you so much.